But it leads to an important question. Are you a child of God? The poet says we're all God's children. And it's beautiful words. But they're unbiblical words. Because the Bible tells a different story. And it's an important question. As children, if we are children of God, that is a different status. That means that we have certain rights. We have a certain expectation. That means there is a future and a promise and a hope that is there. Children of God now have the security of eternity, of heaven itself. But even before we get there, there is the hope and the promise and the fulfillment that God is with me no matter what I'm going through, that His presence is right here beside me. If I am a child of God, that is radically different, and I have different expectations, and I have different understandings, and it changes everything about my life. But are you a child of God? Because while the poet says we're all God's children, the Bible says we're not. And if we believe the Bible over the poet, then that means there are some who think they are, who think they have a right to all those things, and they're deceived. And the reality is they have none of that. Well, thankfully, the first chapter of John's Gospel will make very clear to us what it means to be a child of God and what it means not to be. Now let's start looking at John chapter 1. If you have your Bibles, I hope that you do. If you don't, go to the hallway right now. Get one. Come back in, quick. John chapter 1 is where we're going to be. Last week, Shelton kicked off this little kind of mini-series on the prologue, and we're going to finish it up today. I'm going to start reading in verse number 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at his Father's side. He has made him known. Are you bored with life? Are you caught in the routine to where you feel a sense of boredom with your job, with your career? Do you have a sense of boredom maybe in your relationships, maybe with your marriage, maybe in the stage and season of life? Do you ever feel a sense of boredom about this town, about this community, this place? Would you say, not would you say are there seasons, are there moments or seconds of boredom, but instead, would you say that boredom can be a general definition of where you are today? And is that boredom expressing itself? Boredom can express itself in a frustration, in a nervousness, an anxiety, a desire to act, but yet an inability to know what to do or to do anything. It can result in tragic decision-making and inappropriate risk-taking. Many of the affairs that I see are actually affairs of boredom. It's an inability of the person to actually engage their minds and their brains and their activities in the right direction. And so along comes something that kind of begins to brighten their hearts somewhat, and their boredom then actually drives them to an inappropriate relationship. Are you bored? And if so, why? I think this text, as a byproduct, as an off-chance kind of outcome, I think this text, if we truly understand it and take to heart what the Bible is speaking to us today, that one of the byproducts of that, one of the responses, one of the results of that will be a diminishing of our boredom as we engage in what God has actually called us to do and to be. Let's see how the writer kind of gets there. We kicked off the series on this prologue last week, and Shelton mentioned that we're using the image that you're the jury, and that the gospel writer John now is the prosecuting attorney who's trying to make the case that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, John 20, 30 and 31. And so he's making that case. If that's what's going on here, then this prologue, these first 18 verses, are kind of the opening statement. He's going to stand up, John is going to stand up now and begin to lay out some of the issues that he's going to cover later in the book. And he just wants to kind of be those as hooks that he's hanging out there that eventually he's going to come in and put deeper truth to. And so in the first 5 verses, he begins in a very shocking way. To a world at that time that believed that the gods were at odds, that there was no creation and purpose behind creation, that humanity didn't have a distinct purpose. And written today to a group of people who don't even believe that there are any gods, that there is no God, that we were created out of nothing. It just happenstance that caused us to be, and so there's no order in our universe, and so there's no order in our lives, there's no purpose in our lives. To those two differing worlds, John now writes that not only is there an order to creation, but there's actually a purpose for us, that you and I were created for a reason. And so he expands our viewpoint of Jesus, saying he was at the very beginning. And at the very beginning, he is the one that began to help to spin this world into motion. And it has a purpose and a meaning and a value. And that logos, that logic that is there, not only is there a logic that's beyond us, that this world was created under, but that logic is actually a person. It's a person that you and I can know. It's a person of Jesus. And that to the extent that you and I make our lives all about Jesus, we will understand why we were created. We will understand our spot and our position and our place within this world. And we will begin to do a part in what God is calling us to do, to play our part in his redemption story. And so that's how John begins this argument, with that concept. Notice in verse 6 how he then takes a little side note. He begins to introduce a secondary character of this book. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Now, we're going to look at John next week, the song we just sang 2 songs ago, Behold the Lamb of God. That's the passage for next week. And so we'll look more in depth at John then. But I just want to point out just a couple things about John at this moment to make sure that we don't get confused. First and foremost, we have to understand we're talking about 2 different Johns here, right? And you always got to keep your Johns separate. There's anything Heidi Fleiss taught us, you always got to keep. That's not exactly how I meant to say that, but we got to distinguish between the 2 characters that are at play here. So you have John the Apostle, right? That we'll see later in the book. He in all likelihood is the one who wrote the Gospel of John. John the Apostle. It's interesting. At no point during the book does he name himself. To clarify who's who, he just doesn't name himself. Instead, he calls himself the beloved disciple, which I find hilarious. I mean, it's the same way I refer to myself at my mom's house. And so to distinguish between me and my sister, and I assume, I don't know why John calls himself the beloved disciple. Maybe there was some nickname there that Jesus had given him, and this isn't nearly as arrogant as it sounds. But it sounds horrific, in my opinion. But I can't say that about the Bible. So keep that to yourselves. And so you have John, the apostle, who probably wrote the book called The Beloved Disciple. But then you have John the Baptist. And so the John that John is talking about here is not the John who wrote the book, right? You got to keep those separate. So John the Baptist is somebody different. He's the one, remember the biblical story, the story in Luke 2, the birth story of Jesus, that the angel came to Zechariah first and said, hey, Zechariah, Elizabeth's going to be pregnant. And so Elizabeth got pregnant. And about 6 months later, the angel visits Mary, and Mary goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth. And at that moment, John in the womb now leaps for joy over the pregnancy of Mary, right? That's who John the Baptist actually is. But notice within that story something very important. John the Baptist is 6 months older than Jesus. Now think about in that culture, not in ours, but in that culture, honor and glory and so many of the rights went by age. And so if you have 2 twins that are born, 2 twin boys are born, and one is born just minutes before the other, the oldest son gets most of the property. He is the heir to the throne. He gets all the rights of being the firstborn son, even though the second boy was right there. And so for his entire life, the younger son has to give honor and glory to the older brother. It's interesting here that in that culture where honor always went by age, John, the older by earth age, is deflecting all the attention to Jesus, the younger, saying he's the one. And so John goes to this great length, and you can see almost in the repetition of the word. It doesn't come across very clear in the English, but you can see the strange repetition of the word witness. There was a man, verse 7, he came as a witness to bear witness. That's making it very clear now what his task actually was. He was trying to point people to other people. He was trying to point people toward Jesus. And this is what John's message is. And so then the writer returns now back to the main topic of Jesus. Verse number 9. The true light, which enlightens everyone, this is now Jesus, was coming into the world. But notice verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Hear the tragedy in that. We all have a fear of rejection. We do. I have a fear of rejection. My guess is that you do as well. And it's hard. It's hard when somebody rejects you. You take it personally. You begin to question your own soul and all those things. It's very difficult. And Jesus experienced a rejection that we can't even begin to imagine. But it's one thing to experience a rejection from other people. It's one thing when somebody who doesn't know me very well rejects who I am. It's something radically different when it's somebody who knows me well, when it's a friend, when it's a family member. Imagine the pain and the sorrow of being turned away from your own home. Some of you know that all too well. The rejection of being turned away by your parents or your children or your spouse. This is the story that Jesus experienced. It says he came to his own. He came to this nation of Israel, these people, God's chosen people. They've been proclaiming for centuries that God was going to do something. He was going to rescue them in some way. And finally, God does something. And they turn their back to it. They reject him. And the text here, translations kind of differ just a little bit there on verse 11. He came to his own people. The text here says, did not receive him. That's a beautiful picture there. What does it mean to receive Jesus? It means to welcome him now into your life, to see him for who he actually is, and to receive him properly in the same way that if some honored dignitary were to show up in my house and I just treated him like I treated the person that does the yard, I would not be receiving him properly. Instead, I have to put in all these preparations to equal out my reception of him to who he actually is. And the world just simply did not do that. Some translations here, maybe the NIV, maybe you have the King James, some translations, instead of saying it did not receive him, the text says it did not recognize him. So he came to his own, and his own did not recognize him. I like the difference there because I think it gives us a different angle to come in at this word. To not recognize somebody, one way you don't recognize somebody is you just don't see them. And this happens to me all the time. I feel horrible about it. But there are times in which I just don't recognize you. Jenny got me into playing in this mixed doubles tennis league last year. And 3 weeks in a row, we went out to the tennis court, and I walked across the net, and I looked my opponent in the eye and said, "Hi, I'm Kevin Thompson." And 3 weeks in a row, I heard this. "We know." I said, "Okay." I said, and you are? And they introduced themselves, and then they followed it up with, "We go to community." Well, in all fairness to me, none of you in this room are currently wearing sports attire, a hat, and sweating profusely, right? But 3 weeks in a row, I didn't recognize them. I wanted to. I just didn't know who they were. You know why it didn't happen 4 weeks in a row? Fourth week in a row, I showed up and I said, "Hey, Jenny, go introduce yourself." Jenny walks across the court and says, "Hi, I'm Jenny Thompson." They go, "We know." And Jenny goes, "Oh, okay, what's your name?" And they said, "Yeah, yada, yada." And I don't know why I don't recognize people. They said, "Yada, yada," and we go to community. And I walked up and goes, "Jenny, you don't know they go to community?" "Oh, come on. You know they sit back there at one of our locations." "Oh, I didn't even see you Sunday." "Well, I was there." "Well, I know, but I just didn't see you, like out in the hallway," right? We cannot recognize people just because we're ignorant of them or we don't see them. Jesus came into this world, and a lot of people didn't recognize him because they were just ignorant of him. And there's a lot of people living out there today who just don't know. Their eyes are now blinded, and they're so caught up into their daily living that they don't recognize that we have an opportunity now to have a relationship with God himself, and they have not recognized him. And having not recognized Jesus, you can't receive him. You can't welcome him into your life. You can't have your life changed by him until you recognize him for who he actually is. People were so close to God, and they never knew it. It breaks my heart at the thought of being a pastor of some people who are so close to God, and they don't know it. So close to having their eternal destiny changed, to having their life changed. And they are simply clueless to who is so close to them. But there's another way not to recognize somebody. Whenever I was in high school, I did a ride-along with the Fort Smith Police Department. And so I was doing this article on kind of what they were going through. And this is 20 years ago, right? And so during the middle of this ride-along, it was fascinating. I mean, the whole thing was fascinating. I had never been around law enforcement that much. My sister had, but I had... well, she had friends. She had friends. And so I'd never been around law enforcement that much, so it was all fascinating to me, right? You get in the car and, the cop tells you, hey, if anything goes wrong, here's your gun. And I'm like, what? Like if it gets to the point with me with a gun, things have gone horribly wrong, right? And so we arrested this one lady at the Walmart it's not even there anymore, out on Midland, and she got so mad at the officer that the only way she knew how to get back with her was to pee all over herself, right? And so I'll never forget that. And so a Southside party got busted that night. The Friday night I did a ride-along. Like one of the parties from my high school got busted that night, and I had a friend call me and say, hey, how dare you, rat us out? But I had the perfect alibi, and I said, hey, y'all never tell me where the parties are. And he was like, oh yeah, you couldn't have, that wasn't you. So nobody was ever mad at me, right? Because they knew I didn't know where the parties were. How could I? That was just coincidence, right? And so, but I'll never forget, we're driving through downtown Fort Smith, and I asked the officer about gang activity. And she said, oh, well, we don't have any gang activity in Fort Smith. I said, really? She goes, that's what we say. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, we've chosen not to recognize the gangs in Fort Smith. I said, well, what does that mean? She said, well, as soon as you give a gang credit for doing something, it then encourages other gangs to do something worse so they'll get credit. And it then validates who they are, and it gives them a voice and a platform. And so for as long as we can, we're not going to recognize what they're doing, because the recognition would have consequences. Now, I don't know what the current theory is in Fort Smith, and I don't know about the current level of gang activity in Fort Smith. Some of you do, but I don't at this moment, because you're in law enforcement, and so I don't currently know. But there's a truth in that. Jesus came into this world, and some people didn't recognize him because they were ignorant of him. But many people don't recognize him because they know as soon as they do, it will demand something of them. And so they will pretend as though he doesn't exist. They will pretend as though he was just a good teacher. They will pretend as though he was just a good prophet. They will pretend as though he does some good stuff. But they will not recognize him as the Son of God, as God himself, as the Messiah, because the moment they do, that will then demand of them to recognize their need for humility, to fall on their face before God, to obey and to do whatever it says that they should do. Instead, they want to go their own way. They want to be their own God. They want to make their own decisions. And so instead of recognizing Jesus for who he is, they will push him aside and willfully, out of disobedience, say, I don't know who that is. Which are you? Are you just apathetically going through life, now ignorant of God? Because you're unwilling to do the work, because you're unwilling to open your eyes, because you're unwilling to look beyond yourself and to ask the question, is Jesus really the Son of God? Or are you now willfully ignorant of that? Or are you just willfully disobedient? Do you know who Jesus is, but because you know what it will demand of you and you want to go your own way, you have chosen to live in rebellion against him? Either way, notice, either way, you're outside of who he is. And this text is going to say, either way, you're not a child of God. Whether it just be through ignorance or willful rebellion, either way, you are then living apart from all the promises we sing about, all the beautiful sacrifice of Jesus and the consequences that come with it, the byproducts and the benefits. if you are not a child of God, no matter for what reason, you stand outside of that. And John says one of the great ironies and yet one of the great tragedies is that Jesus came to his own and we didn't recognize him. And having not recognized him, we did not receive him into our lives. But there's good news. The good news is simply this, that if you want to become a child of God, you can. That if you recognize that without God, you are without hope, that you stand outside of his promises, that you're in this world all by yourself, that actually instead of being a child of God, if you're not a child of God, then what you actually are is now a traitor to his kingdom. But there's an opportunity here. Notice what the text says. As soon as I find it, notice what this text says. Verse 11, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, so there are some who did. There are some who received him. So they recognized him for who he was, and they received him. They welcomed him. They gave him the proper reception into their life. Who believed in his name. That's how you receive him. You now believe, and not just a cognitive belief, but instead a belief that now pushes action. Notice the text. He gave the right to become children of God. That whenever you receive him, whenever you believe in him, you then have a right to be a child of God. So notice this misconception. Notice when the poet says we're all God's children, it sounds good, but it's wrong. It sounds good, but it's not true. We are not all God's children. Now it's important. If what the poet is trying to say is we're all God's children, therefore we're all created equal, we all have value, we all have meaning, that there's no person that is above another person, that we all have this meaning and value because of our created humanity, they're right about that. But just their language is wrong. You see, the Bible makes it very clear that we were created in the image of God, which gives us an equal value, an equal weight, an equal worth. My daughter with Down syndrome is just as equal as my son who does not have Down syndrome. The person of wealth sitting in this room is just as equal as the person of poverty sitting in this room. No matter your color of skin, no matter your background, no matter your own sins, no matter your own temptations, we all share an equal humanity, and that places us before God in total equality. There's no question about that. But that standing is not because we're all God's children. That standing is because we're all God's creation. We were created in the image of God, and that now gives us equal value in God's eyes, placing us above the rest of creation. It's why the human being in the womb has the same value as a human being on the deathbed, has the same value as a human being living in riches, has the same value as a human being living in poverty. They all of us have the same value. But that is not because we're all God's children. That is because we're all God's creation. Now that creation then rebelled against God. We sinned. We fell. And at that moment, that put us as enmity between us and God. We were rebels against us and God, treasonous in every way. And we have walked outside of the family of God. And now, apart from Jesus Christ, we are without hope and without God, orphans and aliens in this world. And yet God, because of his great love for us, has chased after us and is desiring to bring us back into his family. And he has made a way through his son, Jesus Christ. So that anybody who now recognizes Jesus for who he is, and that recognition then causes a reception within their own life, a cause of belief, more than just a cognitive idea, but instead a belief that now follows in action, in obedience, we now have the right to be children of God. In much the same way that we have a beautiful picture of this in our world of adoption. There's a child out there who for whatever reason, does not have a family. They're an orphan. They're all by themselves. They're alone in this world, and loving people take them in. Maybe they begin to foster them, and they take them in, and that child becomes a part of their family. Maybe a decision finally comes to the point of, hey, we want to adopt this child. We want to make that child our own. But still, that child is not their own. Not until they go into a court of law and there's a judge that hears the case, and eventually whenever he drops the gavel, at that moment, the legal standing of that child then changes, and in the eyes of the law, that child goes from an orphan to a child of this family. And it has all the consequences thereof. I wonder today, has there been a moment in your life, has there been a legal precedence in your life in which you stood before a holy and just God, and because Jesus was on your side, that judge, now hearing and seeing your faith, dropped the gavel and said, you are now a child of God? If there hasn't been that moment, if there hasn't been that decision, if there hasn't been that evidence of belief, that evidence of your recognizing and receiving Jesus Christ now, you run the temptation of thinking you're a child of God when you're really not. But the good news is you can become one. You can become one. In much the same way that I did as a little boy, May 5th, 1988, on my bed. In that moment, I recognized Jesus for who he was, and I received him into my life. And that reception, all that meant to me was now I was going to obey him and follow after him. You can do the same thing. Right now, right where you are. It seems so minor and so petty and so insignificant to us in our little minds. But in the very moment that we begin to say, God, I want you, I receive Jesus, then in the great cosmic courthouse, the Father drops his gavel and says, if you're with my boy, then you're mine. And everything changes. You have the great hope and promise of eternity. It means all your sorrows will eventually be wiped away, and all of this will begin to make sense. But you don't have to just wait for them. But instead, you have the promise of the Holy Spirit at work within your lives right now, meaning whatever is going on within your life, he is there to comfort you and to guide you and to use you now to point other people toward Jesus. All the promises that we sing of, all the hope and the promises that we read of are all true of you if you are a child of God. Now notice what John makes sure that we understand. Because if you're not very careful, if you just put it that way, then it can sound like that the reason I'm a child of God and somebody else isn't is because I was smart enough to figure it out and they weren't. And so I can brag about what I've done. But John says it doesn't work that way. Notice what the text says. He gave the right to become children of God, verse 13, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Why am I a child of God? I'm a child of God solely because God chose me to be. He opened my eyes. That caused somebody to fall out right there. He opened my eyes. I know. Hey, the angels were shocked too, but he chose me, right? And so he opened my eyes. The reason I'm a believer and somebody else isn't is simply because God's grace opened my eyes, and now in faith I've responded to him. And so I can take no credit for it. I can't look at somebody who's not a Christian, who's not a believer, and to judge them and to look down upon them and to not understand why they can't just get it right. Instead, in complete and total gratitude, every time I look at my own life, I'm grateful to God for what he's done for me because I have not deserved it in any way whatsoever. And once we recognize him and receive him, we believe in him. John then uses these last couple of verses to introduce in his prologue what exactly we're recognizing. What exactly we're receiving. Verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen the glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And notice verse 16. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. In these last couple of verses, I just want to point out two things. There's 50 sermons here, but I just want to preach two of them right now. In 5 minutes. These two phrases that begin to reveal to us as we recognize Jesus, here's what we're seeing. The first phrase is a simple phrase, grace and truth. And that when God looks at us, he sees us in grace and truth. Now, grace, you need to be writing this down. Grace, remember now, is God's unmerited favor toward us. It's a downward love. It's a love that can never be earned or deserved. It's a love that can never be prodded down from heaven. Instead, grace is completely the volitional will of the person giving that type of love. And that is what God has given to us. In no response to who we are, in no response to what we've done, God, because of his own great love, has chosen to love us. And yet notice, that love is wedded with truth. You see, that kind of explodes my human mind. Do you know why some people love me? It's because they don't know me. They don't know me, and so they love me. I mean, I've had people before. Maybe they attend here. Maybe they watch online. Maybe they don't love me if they read me, but maybe they watch, and they think, man, I kind of like that guy. He's kind of fiery. He's kind of passionate. He's occasionally funny. I kind of like that guy. And then they get to know me. And they're like, this is it? And they turn to Jenny. And Jenny's like, yep. That's it. He's greatly disappointing, isn't he? I had somebody this week online say I really want to visit community because I'd really like to meet you someday. And I responded, I'm going to be a great disappointment. I wasn't joking. I wasn't being falsely humble. It's just truth. Right? Some people love me because they don't know me. That's not God. God knows me better than I know myself. He's aware of the depth of my own depravity to a level I can't even begin to imagine. And yet he still loves me. You see, parental love sometimes can blind us, right? We used to joke like crazy with Ed. Ed loved Jennifer so much that he just couldn't, she could do no wrong in his eyes. Now, in Shara's eyes, Shara saw the whole picture, right? But Ed just couldn't see it. And so we used to joke like crazy. And so we were friends growing up. And so anytime we needed something out of Ed, we'd send Jennifer in to get it, right? And that didn't stop in high school. Like when I came on staff here, I'd still, hey, Jennifer, here's what I need. And so she'd go to her dad and come back and say, all right, Kevin, you got a raise. All right, thank you. He just loves so much that love begins to blind the truth. I can see it with my own kids. We see it all. This is why parents act like fools on the ball fields, right? Their love is so great, they can't see the absence of talent in their child's ability, right? They just can't see it. And they love so much, they think their child is that good. They ain't that good. And so they begin to act fools because of their love. They're loving in grace, but not full truth. Human beings, we can't love in full truth. But God can. Which means he knows more about your sin than you know. You're far worse than you realize. You see, there are ways that I sin that I know that I sin, I'm wrong, and I feel bad about it. There are other ways that I sin that I'm just ignorant. I don't know that that's even wrong. But there are ways that I sin that I actually think is right. I am so broken, so deprived, so sin-stained that some of the things I am most confident about in life is actually in complete contradiction to the Word of God. And so not only am I wrong in that, but I'm actually prodding and poking and begging other people to follow me in my wrongness. Now imagine if my kids this afternoon, if my kids disobey me, that'll be frustrating. If they willfully disobey me, that'll be frustrating. Now if they ignorantly disobey me, well, that'll be a little frustrating, right? All right, keep this amongst yourselves. I didn't tell you this story. I should not do this. In the first service, Silas, on the front row, a little bored, because he didn't hear the sermon yet, was a little bored. And so he began to mimic every motion that I made. That is not funny. And I saw it, and so I tried to stop it. And so I made a motion, I went like this, and I went, but he didn't get the message. And he continued. And near the end of the sermon, I got a little fired up, and so did he. And everybody here saw it. The person seated next to him, 2 seats down, did not. And at one point, I looked at her, and because I'm a professional communicator, I can do stuff like this. I looked at her, and I went, and she didn't get it either. And finally, somebody in the front row, and I don't recommend you do this, somebody in the front row said, hey, we can't hear a word you're saying because Silas is mimicking everything you do. Right? So I just tried to ignore that because I didn't want to call him out. I didn't want to embarrass him. In that, he was not trying, I don't think. He was not trying to disobey. He's a little boy mimicking his daddy. Right? If my children ignorantly disobey me, I correct them. But what if he was doing that on purpose? What if he knew? Daddy's up there in the fishbowl and he can't do anything. And what if he was down here, and what if whenever I gave him the look, what if he went? You know what that would do to me? I can't say it on stage. It would frustrate me. That's what it would do to me. It would cause me to reevaluate my theory on spanking, right? You know how great God's love is for you? Even when you are rejoicing in your wrongdoing and encouraging others to do the same, in love and compassion, His grace does not change toward you. Grace and truth. Now notice what this means. Take your Bibles, flip over, it won't be on the screen. Flip over to Psalm 51. Notice what this means for us. Oh, listen to that. Glory, that's good. Listen Listen, this is what this means for us. It means as we grow in grace, we need to grow in truth. As God gives us grace, it's going to give us truth as well. And part of that truth is we need to know more about ourselves. And so part of the maturity process of a Christian is as I mature in my understanding of who God is, in my own eyes, I actually get worse and worse and worse. And as I get worse and worse and worse, I look up at the love of God as greater and greater and greater, and that causes me even more gratitude toward Him. And so notice what happens when a Christian sins. We all sin, we all fall. None of us are going to live perfect lives. But when a Christian does so, their response is radically different. It's not that every affair is not the same. Every stealing of money is not the same. Every murder is not even the same. In God's eyes, notice the difference here. A Christian responds differently. This is now Psalm 51. This is David having committed this egregious sin against Bathsheba. It resulted not only in an affair, but ultimately murder, the death of a child, one of the ugliest scenes in the entire Scripture. And yet this is a man after God's own heart. And here's why. Notice in Psalm 51, now feeling grief over his sin, here's how he responds to his sin. And to be honest with you, I don't care what your sin is. I care about what your Psalm 51 is. This is what matters here. Not your ability to live perfectly, but instead, whenever you make mistakes now, to follow it up with Psalm 51. And as he is crying out to God, listen to what he says in verse number 5. He has a better understanding of his own sin. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. He's saying there, I'm far worse than I realized. But verse 6, behold, you delight in truth in my inward being. So in verse 5, as he's understanding his sin is far greater and far deeper than he ever even began to imagine, he's saying, God, you're delighting in this revelation. Turn back to John chapter 1. You're delighting in this revelation. Jesus wants us to have a grace and a truth about us. He loves us in grace and truth, which means he knows us better than we know ourselves, and yet his grace doesn't change. And as we walk into his grace, we will learn more about ourselves. This is what so many people are learning in Celebrate Recovery. This is it. That the way you experience more of God's grace is to actually dig down deeper into your own brokenness. So many people aren't growing and maturing in their faith in God because they're afraid of finding out more bad stuff about themselves. Well, guess what? You're going to find out more bad stuff about yourselves. But God's love is going to be greater than you can ever even begin to imagine. And so in a program like Celebrate Recovery, if you're just walking with the gospel, if you're looking at your own lives, what will happen as you grow in God's grace, you'll begin to dig down deeper into your own soul and who you are, and you will figure out it is more messed up, it is more ugly, it is more broken than you ever begin to imagine. You will find that you've done more wrongs than you can ever even begin to fathom. And yet in the midst of that, God's love for you is not changed. He loves you in grace and truth. He knows you better than you know yourself, and he loves you anyway. And oh, how this confronts the human dilemma, because we think if they ever find out who we are, they won't love us. It's why guys get caught and then they slowly leak the truth to their wives because they're thinking if she ever finds out everything, she won't love me. It's why addicts have such a difficult time admitting the tragedy that they're causing around them. Because if they admit that, they think nobody's going to love me. And yet the great truth here is God himself has already known it all, and he still loves us anyway. And as we grow in that grace, we can actually begin to admit more truth about us and about others. And that will give us the humility that we need, and it will give us the gratitude that he deserves. One other little phrase here that strikes me about this, the fullness of who God is. Notice what it says. Grace upon grace. Verse 16. And from his fullness, having recognized and received him, we have all received grace upon grace. You see, so often whenever I look at God, I think about God the way I look at like high school math, that we all start out with 100, but then we start getting points deducted. And so often I think about God that I get grace minus these 3 sins. But with God, it doesn't work that way. It might with me and you, but it doesn't work that way with God. With God, it is grace upon grace. Which means the moment that you think you've exhausted it, the moment you think you've done such wrong, you've created such hell in the lives of other people that you think nobody else does love you and nobody else on earth does love you at that moment. Even at that moment when you think God cannot love you anymore, God gives you grace upon grace. That means there's more grace out there than you're ever going to experience. There is no limit to his love. There is no limit to his grace. That means no matter where you are, no matter how bad it gets, no matter how foolish your own decisions making, no matter where you are in this moment, even if you can't hear my voice anymore, never forget this. Wherever you are, there is still grace for you. It's still there. And everybody else might turn their back on you, and you might be all alone and isolated from everybody else, but God himself will still love you, grace upon grace. And you know what grace does? Grace creates life. Remember, if we believe in him, the result is life. And grace creates life. It creates activity. It creates energy. It creates connections and communities and challenges. Are you bored with your life? Are you bored with your marriage? With this station of life? With this town? With this church? With this sermon? Are you bored with your job? You know why you're bored? Because you aren't experiencing grace in this moment. Because grace is never boring. Hate is predictable. Hate's predictable. You doubt that? I guarantee you that there's somebody planning a terrorist attack for this week, somewhere around the world, right? Somewhere. It's predictable. And you know what's going to happen whenever that happens? All these other people are going to start blaming each other for what they did. Right? And you know where Westboro Baptist Church is going to be? With signs. Protesting. It's predictable. Right? Grace isn't. What's grace going to do this week? Who knows? Who knows? Terrorist attack happens. A mass murder happens. Hate's going to be predictable. Hate's going to be blaming. Hate's going to be shouting. Hate's going to be protesting. You know what grace is going to do? Grace is going to do 1,000 different things. Grace is going to cause some to run in and to help the injured. Grace is going to cause some to run to the hospital and to comfort the loved ones. Grace is going to cause some to raise money and to pay for the funerals. Grace is going to cause some to put on a badge and to go serve. Grace is going to cause some to put on a uniform and go stand up for justice. Grace is going to cause some to say, I can't do anything with that tragedy, but I can go across the street and love my neighbor. I can go downtown and find somebody different than me. I can sit down and listen to somebody else's pain. Grace can get creative. It can get beautiful. It can move us and motivate us into action, into activities that can take us to places we could never even begin to think. How many of our students thought they'd ever be in the 9th Ward in New Orleans? Grace moved them there. How many, Donnie and Rachel, did they ever expect to be in dislocation? Undisclosed. Sometimes that's a hard word. Did they ever expect to be in an undisclosed location? If I could just say the country would be so much easier. An undisclosed location in Central Asia? No, but grace took them there. Grace can take you places you can never even begin to imagine. If you are bored today, it's because you're standing outside the grace that God has given you. Hate is predictable. Grace is not. Grace caused Jesus to step down from the comforts of heaven itself and come down to this earth in the form of a little bitty baby. Grace is what caused him to call disciples that did not deserve to be loved, that weren't very able and capable most of the time. Grace is what caused him to just have some fun and change some water into wine. It's what caused him to take a little meal and feed 5,000. It's what caused him to call Lazarus out of the grave. It's what caused him to take a little stroll across the lake and to call Peter out to do the same, even though he knew Peter would fall. Grace is what ultimately drove him to the cross for what Hebrews said is the joy set before him. Grace will take you places you never even begin to imagine. Give you challenges that are hard. Notice the question of grace is always this: how can I love you? How can I love you? You need to ask that question to every single person who responds to your Facebook post. Some of us have to love more than others. How can I love you? You need to say that to every person in your neighborhood, every person you work with, and the person you want to love the least, you need to ask that question about the most. How can I love you? And if you will live out that love, if you will constantly be working with God to figure out, how can I love this person that I don't like? How can I love this person that's different from me? How can I love this person that I don't know? If you will live out that life, you will never be bored. You know what hate asks? It asks the exact same question. How can I love you? It's all in the affliction. There is such a thin line between hate and grace. Make sure you know which side you're on. And let's go love people. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me?